Hello again, my Darksome friends. If you are new here, my name is Shauna, and you are listening to the Darksome Lounge. And if you're returning, welcome back to our little corner of the shadows. This is a space for all of us outliers who love everything from the grit of rock and roll to the mystical to the macabre, just living on the edge of normal. So, grab your coffee or tea, settle in, and let's get into it. So, have you ever been in a room with a lot of people or at a party and you just kind of feel like you're operating on a completely different frequency? You know, like everyone else got handed the handbook on how to blend in and you accidentally threw yours out the window years ago. Well, today we're talking about why that feeling isn't necessarily something to fix. It's actually the best part of who we are. So, on my very first day to 7th grade, after coming from an elementary school where I had no issues with being myself and having fun and, feeling like I was at the top of my game with friends and just a life where I really didn't have to struggle, I went into this whole new world. I remember my first day, we called it junior high here. It was 7, 8, and 9 back in the 70s and 80s. It was probably around 1982, when I started going into the 7th grade. And like I said, we call it junior high, not middle school. I know they've changed that nowadays. I remember the first day of school, and I remember sitting in the back seat of a station wagon because, how very 70s and 80s is that? My uncle, who was, or is, I almost said, was, who is 2 years older than me, was sitting in the front seat. And, he's very much like my brunkle. At the time, he's like my brother, but we grew up together. We were very close. And so him and his best friend, Robbie was also in the car, and Robbie's mom was driving. And we were driving to the first day of school. And I remember that feeling of being nervous and anxious, but excited. I remember the feeling of having like my fresh school books in my lap, and we were listening to the radio, and I remember Total Eclipse of the Heart came on. I remember that feeling, and it was a whole new era. It felt good. I was with my family. I felt safe, and my brunkle, since he was 2 years older than me, he's already been at that school prior, and I was just kind of following in his suit. So he would have been in 9th grade, and I would have been entering into the 7th grade, and it was good. Like I said, I felt excited. I felt safe to be with him, and I felt comfortable, listening to Total Eclipse of the Heart. And to this day, that's still just, that song, I love it. And rest in peace, Bonnie Tyler. So as we pull up to the school, I don't know, probably around 8 o'clock in the morning, and in Northern California in Sonoma County, back in those days, a little bit in these days too, I don't really know when the kids nowadays go back to school. But back then, I remember we would go to school sometime around Labor Day. So it would probably be in September, like the second week or something. It was foggy. It was a little bit of a misty day. Here, we have a lot of fog in Sonoma County. And I remember getting out of the car and hearing the doors shut, and she pulls off. And my brunkle, who has always been extremely confident, and to this day, he lives in New York, and has quite an affluent career. He was a blue man, if you know who that is. He went to Harvard. He's an actor, and he's incredibly self-assured of himself on the outside. Of course, we all have our moments, and, but he's a deeply wonderful, emotional person, and I look up to him. But, going to school, he was extremely confident. He's already been there for 2 years. And so he kind of knows everybody. He has his own vibe and his own tribe. The school bell rings, and he goes off, and Robbie goes off. And I remember the feeling of all of a sudden, that safe feeling, it was gone. I was in a new world, in a new environment, And I didn't know these people. Half of my friends have been dispersed and, went to other schools because they were in other districts. And I remember sitting there looking around and the bustle of all these kids that I didn't know anything about, wearing different clothing that I was ever used to in elementary school. It's like all of a sudden the 15-year-olds, because, they were in ninth grade, 14 or 15-year-olds, come out of the hallways and they're going to their class. And I'm thinking, not at the time, but I'm thinking now, like, hey, you remember Matthew McConaughey, right? Like, all right, all right, all right. Yeah, that kind of vibe. These kids look like they were 18 in my eyes. And I was just like this little 11 or 12-year-old just going, where am I? What is this world? And all of these new kids were wearing different kind of clothing, from, rock and roll to the new wave that was coming out. And, still the ones that look like Matthew McConaughey, and I'm like, wow. And all of a sudden, I shrank. I was shy. I was scared, introverted. And I remember that feeling of, not knowing where I belong. And, and then I hustled off to my class, and it was just an interesting environment. It was all fresh and new. And, honestly, I didn't know where I belonged. I had to make new friends because the ones I had, I had like one friend here and there that might have transferred over with me, but everybody else went to different schools. But truly, on a day that if, she was gone, or because she was sick or something, I was there alone. I didn't know how to fit in. I didn't know who I was or how to belong. And then, as time passed, feeling that way, feeling very introverted and unsure of myself, I certainly wasn't sitting at the quad where all the popular kids were. And, I felt, if I am not popular, if I'm not sitting at the quad, and if I'm not, engaged the way they were engaged, if I wasn't forthcoming or fun or self-assured, then, if I was introverted, then what does that make me? Well, I had that imposter syndrome. I was an outlier. And if I was an outlier, what did that mean? What was I? And that is when I started to discover and find punk rock. That is when I started to discover myself and to create myself, to find the part of me that belonged. And that was where I delved deep into that edgier side of normal. It was difficult, but I blossomed and I finally found my tribe. Because I was not normal in my eyes to sit. I was not normal enough to sit with the cool kids or the popular kids. So, if I wasn't that, what was I? I was an outlier. So, probably around eighth grade summer, basically, I had my mom take me to a hair salon. I think it was something like Supercuts. I don't know if you have them wherever you are. But she asked me what I wanted to do with my hair. And I said, shave it. So the stylist shaved the sides of my head and the back of my head. And I had like this cute little pixie haircut that was all spiky on top. And in ninth grade, I came back to that school with purple hair and a shaved head. And I found myself the summer before. And now I am 55 years old. And no, Mom, it's not a phase. It's who I am. I think almost all of us who gravitated towards the edges have heard at some point in their life, it's just a phase, or you'll grow out of it. And look, some of us have been carrying around these roots for decades. But whether you've been walking this path since the 80s, like I have, and like most Gen X, or you're just discovering your own gritty, darksome soul right now, whether you found your home in the rock and roll or alternative fashion, or even carving out an alternative spiritual path, we realize something very important. Those things weren't a costume that we tried on. they were just actually the first time we recognized ourselves in the mirror. So, if you grew up feeling like you were looking at the world through, a slightly different lens, because that is what us outliers are, we definitely look at the world in just a different, grittier way. We tend to gravitate towards the unique or the macabre. You probably spent a lot of years trying to soften your edges just to fit in or keep the peace. And I know I certainly have. And I'm not saying to not do that because, I'm not saying you have to be this really hardcore punk rocker and just be aggressive. And I mean, there are times to be, to go with the flow. And that's totally normal. But trying to fit into a mold that was never built for you in the first place, yeah, honestly, that's exhausting. So that's really why I wanted to open up this lounge, because being an outlier does not mean that you were exiled. It just means that you or me, we all chose a different map. And as we move through our lives now, the real freedom is finally dropping that need for anyone else's approval. So, I mean, if you take anything away from our time together today, let it be this. Your way of moving through the world, it is not a phase, and it's certainly not an accident. Choosing to remember who you are, to stay true to your own depth and walk your own gritty path in a world that often makes everyone else want to, like blend you into the background, that is the real power. That is where we stand strong and stand tall and embrace our darksome, edgier, gritty, badass selves, right? You don't need to shrink yourself. And you definitely don't need to apologize for your shadows. You and myself are exactly where you belong. All right. Well, my darksome friends, that is all I have for you today. So, thank you for spending a few minutes of your day in the shadows with me. However, before we close up the lounge, I'm leaving you with a track for your rotation today. The song name, Bastards of Young by The Replacements, 1985. So, go turn it up loud, let it rattle the walls, and I'll catch you in the next one. And so until next time, stay strange and remember to always play in those shadows. And I hope to see you there.